$40 for a winter coat or a stranger's groceries. That was Ethan Becket's choice that night at Palmer's grocery. He chose kindness. 3 nights later, as December wind cut through his thin jacket, the black town car appeared outside the store. The kind that didn't belong on their street. The kind that brought life-changing news wrapped in leather interiors. The rear door opened, and she emerged. The same woman whose hands had trembled as she'd surrendered the baby formula, the bread, the small glass angel that had reminded Ethan of his mother's last Christmas. But now she stood transformed. Powerful. Purposeful. She looked directly at him. And in that moment, Ethan knew his simple act of compassion had set something unstoppable in motion. Because what happened 3 nights ago is the reason this woman is here now. And Ethan still has no idea what it means. 3 nights earlier, the snow had been falling in thick, silent waves. The kind that muffled the world and made everything feel smaller. Colder. More desperate. Ethan had been working the evening shift, his second of the day, because rent was already 5 days late and his landlord had stopped answering texts. His sister, Matilda, was home alone again, probably doing her homework under 2 blankets because the heater in their apartment sputtered more than it worked. He was tired in a way that went deeper than his bones. And then she'd appeared in his line. An older woman, maybe in her late 60s, with a threadbare coat and eyes that looked like they'd been crying for weeks. She'd moved slowly, carefully, placing items on the conveyor belt as though each one cost her something more than money. When the total came up, her face had crumpled. She'd started removing things. Quietly. Without protest. The bread. The soup. The baby formula. And Ethan had wondered, with a pang, who the baby was. A grandchild, maybe. Someone she was trying to take care of when she could barely take care of herself. And then she'd reached for the ornament. It was small. Glass. Shaped like an angel with delicate gold-painted wings. She'd held it for just a second longer than the other items, and Ethan had seen it, the way her fingers curled around it like she was saying goodbye to something precious. That's when his chest had cracked open. Because he knew that feeling. The last Christmas with his mother, they'd had a real tree. Just once. She'd been sick, but she'd smiled when she hung the angel on top, one that looked almost exactly like the one this woman was putting back. His mother had died that winter. Ethan hadn't bought an ornament since. Before he could think it through, before logic or fear or his empty wallet could stop him, he'd pulled out the last $40 he had. The money he'd been saving for a winter coat. The money that was supposed to get him through until his next paycheck. He'd scanned her items back through. "Wait," she'd whispered, her voice hoarse. "I can't." "No one should go hungry at Christmas," Ethan had said, and his voice had been steadier than he'd felt. "Not on my watch." She'd stared at him with wide, glassy eyes. Disbelieving. Speechless. He'd bagged her groceries. Handed them to her gently. Smiled even though his heart was pounding because he'd just given away money he desperately needed. She'd left without another word. And Ethan had walked home that night through wind so cold it burned his lungs, his thin jacket doing nothing against the December air. He hadn't told Matilda. Hadn't let her see him shivering. Hadn't mentioned that the coat he'd been saving for was now gone. He thought the moment was over. He thought she was just another stranger whose story he'd never know. But now she was here, walking through the doors of Palmer's grocery like she owned the air around her. Ethan's manager, Mr. Davison, appeared from the back, his face suddenly tense and confused in the way it got when corporate showed up unannounced. "Ethan," the woman said softly, and her voice was different now, steadier, warmer, but still carrying the weight of something unspoken. "May I speak with you privately?" His pulse spiked. He glanced at Mr. Davison, who was already nodding, waving him toward the small office in the back. Ethan's hands felt numb as he untied his apron. He followed her into the cramped manager's office, where the fluorescent light buzzed and the space smelled like old coffee and invoices. She closed the door, and when she turned to face him, her expression was so full of emotion that Ethan forgot how to breathe. "My name," she said quietly, "is Margaret Caldwell." The name meant nothing to him. But the way she said it, like a confession, like an apology, made his stomach twist. 3 nights ago, she continued, her voice trembling now, you gave me something I thought the world had run out of. Ethan shook his head, confused. It was just groceries. It wasn't. It wasn't just groceries. Her eyes shone. It was proof. Proof of what? She reached into her coat and pulled out a small envelope. It was cream-colored, expensive, and across the front, in elegant script, were words that made no sense. To the person whose kindness finds you when I no longer can. Margaret's hands shook as she held it out to him. My husband wrote this before he died, she whispered. And Ethan, I think he meant it for you. What could possibly be inside that letter? And why does Margaret Caldwell look at Ethan like he just saved more than her groceries? Hi lovelies, someone told me this channel would never reach 1,000 subscribers because real stories don't get views anymore. Let's prove them wrong together. This isn't just entertainment, it's about justice, power, and what happens when someone decides to fight back against impossible odds. I need your support to continue telling these untold stories. Hit subscribe now. The truth deserves to be heard, and you deserve to be part of this movement. Join us. Now, let's step back for just a moment. Ethan didn't reach for the envelope. His hands stayed at his sides, fingers curling into fists, because accepting something he didn't understand felt dangerous. Like opening a door he couldn't close again. I don't know what this is, he said carefully, his voice low. I think you might have the wrong person. Margaret's expression softened, and for a moment, she looked exactly like the woman who'd stood in his checkout line, vulnerable, exhausted, carrying a grief too heavy to name. I don't, she said. I promise you, Ethan. I don't. She set the envelope down on the desk between them, her fingers lingering on the edge as though she couldn't quite let it go. My husband, Jonathan Caldwell, spent 40 years building a foundation, she continued. He funded hospitals, schools, shelters. He believed that kindness was the only currency that mattered. And when he died 8 months ago, he left me with a request. Her voice cracked. He asked me to find proof that the world he believed in still existed. That people still cared when no one was watching. That compassion wasn't just performance. Ethan's throat tightened. So I went looking, Margaret whispered. I dressed down. I visited the places we used to support. I tested people, quietly, carefully, to see if anyone would help a stranger who had nothing to offer in return. She closed her eyes. And every single time, I was disappointed. The words hung in the air like frost. Ethan wanted to say something, but he didn't know what. His mind was still catching up, still trying to reconcile the trembling woman from 3 nights ago with the composed, grieving widow standing before him now. I was going to shut it all down, Margaret said, opening her eyes. The foundation. Jonathan's life's work. I was going to let it die with him because I couldn't bear to keep it alive in a world that didn't deserve it. Her gaze locked onto his. And then you paid for my groceries. Ethan shook his head. That was nothing. You gave me the last money you had. Her voice was firm now, almost fierce. Don't think I didn't notice, Ethan. I saw your coat. I saw the way you walked out into the cold afterward. You gave me something you needed, and you did it without hesitation. His chest ached. You didn't know who I was, she continued. You didn't expect anything in return. You just saw someone struggling. And you helped. She picked up the envelope again and held it out. This letter was Jonathan's idea. He told me that if I ever found someone whose kindness was pure, someone who gave without agenda, I should give them this. And a choice. Ethan stared at the envelope like it might burn him. What kind of choice? Margaret's lips curved into a sad, beautiful smile. Open it, she said gently. And you'll see. Ethan took the envelope with shaking hands. The paper was thick, expensive. the kind of thing he'd never touched before. He broke the seal carefully, as though it might shatter, and pulled out a single folded letter written in elegant, slanting handwriting. To the person whose kindness finds you when I no longer can. If you are reading this, it means my wife has found you. It means that in a world growing colder by the day, you chose warmth. You chose generosity. You chose to see someone else's pain and do something about it. That makes you rare. I have spent my life trying to build a world where people like you are celebrated, supported, and given the resources to do even more good. This letter is my final attempt to continue that work. I don't know your name. I don't know your story. But I know this. If Margaret has given you this letter, you are worthy of what comes next. Inside this envelope, you will find an offer. Not charity. Not a handout. But an opportunity. The choice, as always, is yours. Jonathan Caldwell. Ethan's vision blurred. He read the letter twice, then a third time, and each pass made his heart beat harder, louder, until he could hear it pounding in his ears. I don't understand, he whispered. Margaret reached into her coat again and pulled out a second piece of paper, this one crisp, official, with a letterhead he didn't recognize. Jonathan set aside a fund, she said quietly, for moments like this. For people like you. She handed him the paper. Ethan's eyes scanned the words, but they didn't make sense at first. Numbers. Legal terms. Phrases like educational trust and housing assistance and full scholarship provision. And then he saw the figure at the bottom. His knees nearly gave out. This can't be real. It is, Margaret said, and her voice was so gentle it almost broke him. If you accept, this trust will cover your sister's education, from now through university. It will pay your rent for the next 2 years while you finish your own degree, if you choose to pursue one. And it will provide a stipend so you don't have to work yourself to exhaustion just to survive. Ethan couldn't breathe. He thought of Matilda. Sweet, brilliant Matilda, who did her homework by candlelight when the power got cut off. Who never complained when there wasn't enough food. Who still believed the world was good because Ethan had fought so hard to protect her from the truth. Why? He managed, his voice breaking. Why me? Because you gave when you had nothing, Margaret said simply. And that's the rarest kind of generosity there is. Ethan's hands trembled as he stared at the paper. Everything he'd been fighting for, Matilda's future, a life that didn't feel like drowning, was right here, in his hands. Real. But something in his chest twisted. What do you want in return? He asked, and his voice was barely a whisper. Because nothing was free. He'd learned that the hard way. Margaret's expression shifted, something deep and painful flickering across her face. There is one condition, she said slowly. And just like that, the air in the room changed. Ethan's stomach dropped. Here it is, he thought. The catch. What is it? He asked, forcing himself to meet her eyes. Margaret hesitated, and for the first time since she'd walked into the store, she looked uncertain. I need you to help me finish what Jonathan started, she said. The foundation is still running, but it's lost its heart. The board members care more about optics than impact. I need someone who understands what it's like to struggle. Someone who won't forget why this work matters. She took a breath. I want you to join the foundation. Not as an employee. As a partner. A voice. Someone who can help me decide where the money goes and who it helps. Ethan blinked. I'm a cashier, he said. I don't know anything about. You know everything that matters, Margaret interrupted, and there was a fierceness in her tone now. You know what it's like to choose between groceries and rent. You know what it's like to take care of someone when the world offers no help. You know what kindness costs. Her eyes shone. That's what I need, Ethan. Not a resume. Not credentials. Just you. Ethan stared at her, his heart hammering, his mind spinning. This woman, this stranger, was offering him a way out. A future. A chance to give Matilda the life she deserved. But she was also offering him something terrifying. Responsibility. Visibility. A role he had no idea how to fill. "I need time," he said hoarsely. "I need to think." Margaret nodded, and the understanding in her expression made his throat ache. "Of course," she said softly. "Take all the time you need." She reached into her coat one last time and pulled out a small card with a phone number written on it in the same elegant script. "Call me when you're ready," she said. "Or if you have questions. Or if—" She paused. "If you just need to talk." Ethan took the card, his hands still shaking. Margaret turned toward the door, then stopped. "Ethan," she said, glancing back. "3 nights ago, you saved more than my faith in humanity." Her voice broke. "You saved me." And then she was gone. Ethan stood alone in the cramped office, holding a letter from a dead man and a future he couldn't quite believe in. Outside, the snow was falling again. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan Becket didn't know whether to hope or to run. What will Ethan choose? And what secrets is Margaret still keeping? Ethan didn't go straight home. He stood outside Palmer's grocery in the cold, the envelope and the card tucked inside his jacket pocket, his breath fogging in the December air. The black town car was gone. Margaret Caldwell was gone. But the weight of what she'd offered pressed against his ribs like a stone. His phone buzzed. "Matilda, are you coming home soon? I made spaghetti, but I think I used too much salt." Ethan's chest squeezed. He could picture her so clearly, standing in their tiny kitchen, her dark hair pulled into a messy ponytail, trying so hard to take care of them both even though she was only 10. He typed back quickly. "Ethan, on my way. Save me some." But he didn't move. Because if he went home, he'd have to decide. He'd have to tell Matilda something, or hide this from her. And either option felt impossible. "You okay, man?" Ethan turned. It was Daniel Harrington, one of the stalkers, pulling on his gloves as he finished his shift. Daniel was older, mid-30s, with kind eyes and a habit of checking in on people when they looked like they were falling apart. "Yeah, Ethan Leet. Just tired." Daniel studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You've been pulling doubles all week. You sure you're good?" Ethan forced a smile. "Rent doesn't pay itself." "Yeah, I hear that." Daniel clapped him on the shoulder. "Get some rest, Becket. You're no good to your sister if you collapse." Ethan nodded, waited until Daniel walked away, then finally started toward home. The apartment was warm, or at least warmer than outside. Matilda had lit the 2 candles they kept on the kitchen counter, and the smell of spaghetti and garlic filled the small space. She looked up from her math homework when he walked in, her face brightening. "You're late," she said, but there was no anger in it. Just relief. "Sorry," Ethan said, shrugging off his jacket. "Got held up." Matilda squinted at him. "You look weird." "Weird how?" "I don't know. Like you saw a ghost or something." Ethan's laugh came out hollow. "Just a long day." She didn't look convinced, but she let it go. She always did. Matilda had learned not to push, because pushing meant answers, and answers usually meant bad news. They ate together in comfortable silence, and Ethan tried to focus on the moment. On the taste of 2 salty spaghetti. On the flicker of candlelight. On his sister's presence across the table. But his mind kept drifting back to the envelope. To Margaret's voice. "You saved me." That night, after Matilda went to bed, Ethan sat alone at the kitchen table and pulled out the documents again. He read the letter a 4th time. A 5th. He stared at the numbers on the trust agreement until they blurred. And then he did something he hadn't done in months. He let himself imagine. What if he said yes? Matilda could go to a good school. She could have new clothes, warm boots, a winter coat that actually fit. She could stop worrying about whether they'd have enough food. She could just be a kid. And he could stop drowning. He could finish the degree he'd abandoned when his mother died. He could sleep more than 4 hours a night. He could breathe. But the condition lingered in his mind like a shadow. Join the foundation. Be a partner. Help me decide. Ethan had no idea how to do that. He didn't know anything about philanthropy or boards or how wealthy people made decisions. He barely knew how to keep his own life together. What if he failed? What if he accepted this gift and let Margaret down? Let Jonathan's memory down? What if he wasn't who they thought he was? His phone buzzed, jolting him from his spiral. An unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him swipe. Hello, Ethan. Margaret's voice was soft, careful. I'm sorry to call so late. I wanted to make sure you were all right. Ethan closed his eyes. I don't know what I am. That's fair, she said gently. This is a lot. It's everything, he whispered. And I don't know if I can. You can, Margaret interrupted, and there was so much certainty in her voice that it startled him. I wouldn't have offered if I didn't believe that. Ethan swallowed hard. What if I mess it up? Then we'll fix it, she said simply. Together. Silence stretched between them. There's something else I need to tell you, Margaret said, and her tone shifted, became heavier. Something I didn't say earlier. Ethan's pulse quickened. What? The foundation is in trouble, she admitted. Not financially, but politically. There are people on the board who want to take it in a direction Jonathan never would have approved. They want to prioritize donors over need, optics over impact. Her voice hardened. Victor Blackwood is leading the charge. He's been on the board for 20 years, and he never agreed with Jonathan's approach. Too sentimental for his tastes. Now that Jonathan's gone, he sees his opportunity. Margaret's tone grew urgent. If I can't prove that Jonathan's vision still matters, that kindness still exists, they'll vote me out. And everything he built will become just another tax shelter for the wealthy. Ethan's stomach twisted. That's why you need me, he said slowly. I'm proof. Yes, Margaret whispered. But more than that, Ethan. I think you might be the only person who can help me fight them. And just like that, everything shifted. This wasn't just about Ethan anymore. It wasn't just about Matilda's future or his own survival. It was about something bigger. Something that terrified him. When do you need an answer? He asked. The board meets in 4 days, Margaret said quietly. If you're willing, I'd like you there. 4 days. Ethan looked around the small, worn apartment. At the flickering candles. At the door to Matilda's room, where she slept under 2 blankets because the heater barely worked. He thought about his mother. About the last Christmas they'd spent together. About the glass angel ornament she'd hung on the tree. No one should go hungry at Christmas. Not on my watch. He'd said that 3 nights ago. And maybe it was time to mean it on a scale bigger than a grocery store checkout line. Okay, Ethan said, his voice steadier than he felt. I'll be there. Margaret exhaled, relief and hope tangled together. Thank you, she whispered. And Ethan wondered if he'd just made the best decision of his life. Or the worst. What awaits Ethan at the board meeting? And who will try to stop him? 4 days passed in a blur. Each morning, Ethan woke before dawn to get Matilda ready for school. Each evening, he worked his shift at Palmer's, smiling at customers and stocking shelves while his mind raced with possibilities and doubts. He told Matilda nothing. Not yet. Not until he was sure. The morning of the board meeting arrived cold and bright. Ethan stood in his apartment bathroom, staring at his reflection. He'd ironed his only button-down shirt 3 times. Combed his hair. Shaved carefully. But he still looked like what he was, a grocery store cashier pretending to belong in a world of wealth and power. His phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. Margaret, the car will pick you up at 9. Are you ready? Ethan's hands shook as he typed back. Ethan, as ready as I'll ever be. He'd called in sick to work. Asked his neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, to watch Matilda after school. Prepared for everything except the reality of what he was about to do. When the black town car pulled up outside his apartment building, Ethan's stomach clenched. But he forced himself to walk forward, to open the door, to slide into the leather interior that smelled like privilege and decisions made from comfortable distances. Margaret sat inside, elegant in a navy suit, a small silver pin on her lapel, the same mourning pin she'd worn the first day. "Good morning," she said, her eyes warm with understanding. "You look terrified." Ethan exhaled a shaky laugh. "That obvious?" "Only to someone who knows what it feels like." She reached out and squeezed his hand briefly. "The board doesn't bite. At least, not all of them." "Tell me what to expect," Ethan said as the car pulled away from the curb. Margaret's expression turned serious. 12 board members, including me. 8 were Jonathan's friends. 4 were strategic appointments, wealthy donors with connections we needed. And Victor Blackwood? Margaret's mouth tightened. He was Jonathan's lawyer for decades. Brilliant, ruthless, and utterly convinced that sentimentality is bad for business. He's gathered 3 allies on the board. If he gets one more vote, he'll have majority control. Ethan nodded slowly. "So this is about more than me." "Yes and no." Margaret looked out the window. "You're the proof I need that Jonathan's approach still matters. But more than that, Ethan, you're the voice I need in that room. The perspective." Ethan's pulse quickened. "What exactly am I supposed to say?" "The truth," she said simply. "Your truth." The Caldwell Foundation occupied the top 3 floors of a gleaming tower in the heart of downtown. Floor-to-ceiling windows. Art on every wall. Silence broken only by the hushed conversations of people who never worried about rent or winter coats, or whether the heat would work in December. Ethan felt the stares as Margaret led him through the reception area. The curiosity. The judgment. Who is he? Why is he here? What is Margaret thinking? They rode the elevator to the top floor, where a conference room waited. Glass walls, a massive table, views of the city stretching to the horizon. "Remember," Margaret said quietly as they approached the door, "you have every right to be here." Ethan wasn't sure he believed her. But he straightened his shoulders and followed her inside. 11 faces turned toward them. Margaret walked to the head of the table, her posture strong and certain. "Good morning," she said. "Thank you all for coming. Before we begin our regular agenda, I'd like to introduce someone." She gestured to Ethan. "This is Ethan Becket. He's joining us today as my guest, and as the recipient of Jonathan's Legacy Trust." A murmur rippled through the room. A man in his 60s, silver-haired and hawk-eyed, leaned forward. His tailored suit probably cost more than Ethan's rent for a year. "The Legacy Trust," he repeated, his voice clipped and precise. "The one Jonathan established for, what was it again? The person whose kindness finds you when I no longer can?" His tone made it clear what he thought of such sentimentality. Margaret met his gaze steadily. "That's right, Victor." Victor Blackwood's eyes narrowed as he studied Ethan. "And what exactly did Mr. Becket do to earn this honor?" The way he said it, like he was tasting something spoiled, made Ethan's skin prickle. But before Margaret could answer, Ethan spoke. "I paid for her groceries," he said, his voice quieter than he intended. "That's all." The room went still. Blackwood's eyebrows lifted. "Groceries," he repeated flatly. "Yes." Ethan swallowed hard. "Mrs. Caldwell was in my checkout line. She couldn't afford everything. I paid the difference." "How charitable," Blackwood said. "And for this, you're receiving what?" "A full education trust, housing allowance, financial support." "Victor," Margaret warned. But Ethan held up a hand. "It's okay," he said to her. Then to Blackwood, "Yes, that's what I'm being offered. And what makes your act of charity more deserving than any other?" Blackwood pressed. People perform small kindnesses every day. Should we establish trusts for all of them? Ethan felt heat rise in his face. I don't know if I deserve it, he said honestly. But I know what it meant to me to help her that night. And I know what this opportunity would mean for my sister. A woman at the far end of the table leaned forward. Your sister? Matilda, Ethan said, his voice steadying as he thought of her. She's 10. Our mother died last winter. It's just the two of us now. The room shifted. Something in the atmosphere changed. And you support her by? The woman asked. Working at Palmer's Grocery, Ethan said. Double shifts when I can get them. I was in college, studying education, but I had to drop out when Mom got sick. Margaret stepped forward. This is precisely why Jonathan established the trust, she said firmly. For someone whose generosity comes at personal cost. Someone who gives when they have little to give. Blackwood's expression didn't soften. Noble, he said, but hardly a sustainable approach to philanthropy. Rewarding individual acts of kindness does nothing to address systemic problems. Unless, Ethan said before he could stop himself, the system itself starts to value kindness. Blackwood's eyes locked onto his. Excuse me. Ethan felt a flutter of panic, but he forced himself to continue. I mean, that's what this foundation is supposed to be about, right? Changing the system. Proving that generosity matters. That people matter. The room went still again, and something changed in Victor Blackwood's expression. A flicker of interest. A hint of calculation. You believe you understand what this foundation is about? He asked. After knowing of its existence for, what, 4 days? Ethan hesitated. No, he admitted. I don't understand it yet. But I understand what it meant to Mrs. Caldwell when I helped her. And I understand what it would mean to Matilda if I accept this trust. His voice steadied. And I understand that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change everything. Margaret's eyes shone as she looked at him. But Victor Blackwood simply leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Well, he said softly, isn't that touching? The rest of the meeting passed in a blur. Budgets, reports, strategy discussions that Ethan could barely follow. He sat beside Margaret, trying not to fidget, feeling the weight of scrutiny from around the table. But he also felt something else. Interest, curiosity, the occasional glance that seemed less judgmental and more thoughtful. When the meeting finally ended, board members filtered out one by one. Several nodded to Ethan. One, the woman who'd asked about Matilda, stopped to shake his hand. Eleanor Vance, she said warmly. Jonathan was my cousin. He would have liked you, I think. Ethan smiled. Thank you. And then it was just Ethan, Margaret, and Victor Blackwood, gathering his papers deliberately. He approached them with measured steps. Mrs. Caldwell, he said formally. A word, if you don't mind. Margaret nodded. Of course. Blackwood glanced at Ethan. Privately. But Margaret shook her head. Ethan stays. Blackwood's lips tightened, but he nodded curtly. I assume you plan to move forward with the trust, he said. Ido, Margaret replied. As Jonathan wished. And Mr. Becket will be joining us? In what capacity, exactly? Margaret's chin lifted slightly. As a program advisor. Jonathan believed in diverse perspectives. Ethan brings one we sorely need. Blackwood studied Ethan for a long, uncomfortable moment. Interesting, he said finally. Very interesting. He extended a hand to Ethan. Reluctantly, Ethan shook it. Blackwood's grip was cool and firm. Welcome to the Caldwell Foundation, Mr. Becket, he said. I look forward to seeing what you bring to the table. Something in his tone made Ethan's skin crawl. And as Blackwood walked away, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just made a powerful enemy. Or worse, that Victor Blackwood had just decided Ethan might be useful to him. What is Blackwood planning? And what secret is Margaret still keeping? 2 weeks later, Ethan stood in a kitchen he barely recognized as his own. The apartment hadn't changed. Same worn countertops, same cracked ceiling, same radiator that clanked and sputtered. But the refrigerator was full now. The electricity bill was paid. And the constant knot of anxiety in his chest had begun to loosen. He watched as Matilda spread her homework across the table. New pencils, new notebooks, her face bright with excitement about the science club she'd joined now that Ethan didn't need her to rush home after school. "Will you help me with this project?" she asked, pushing her glasses up her nose. "It's about constellations." "Absolutely," he said, smiling. He hadn't told her everything yet. Just enough that he'd been offered a new job, that they were going to be okay. She was smart enough to know something bigger had happened, but patient enough not to push. His phone buzzed. "Margaret, meeting with the Education Committee tomorrow at 10. Could use your perspective." Ethan's smile widened. The past 2 weeks had been a whirlwind of introductions, orientations, and meetings where he mostly listened and tried to absorb the scope of the Foundation's work. Margaret had been patient, guiding him through the complexities of philanthropy and helping him find his footing. Victor Blackwood had been conspicuously absent, which was why Ethan was surprised when, later that evening, his phone rang with an unknown number. "Hello, Mr. Becket." Blackwood's voice was smooth, precise. "I was hoping we might meet for coffee tomorrow morning." Ethan's pulse quickened. "I have a committee meeting at 10. "Yes, I'm aware. Perhaps 8:30. There's a cafe in the lobby of the Foundation building. Very private." Warning bells rang in Ethan's mind. "What's this about?" A pause. "Information I believe you should have," Blackwood said carefully. "About Margaret. And about why you're really here." Ethan's stomach tightened. "I know why I'm here." "Do you?" Blackwood's tone shifted. 8:30, Mr. Becket. "I promise it will be worth your time." He hung up before Ethan could respond. The cafe was elegant and quiet, tucked into a corner of the Foundation's lobby. Victor Blackwood sat at a corner table, 2 coffee cups already waiting. "Thank you for coming," he said as Ethan slid into the seat across from him. Ethan didn't touch the coffee. "What's this about?" Blackwood studied him. "You're direct. I appreciate that." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thin folder. "I wanted to discuss Jonathan's will. Specifically, the portion regarding Margaret." Ethan frowned. "That's private. And none of my business." "Ordinarily, I would agree." Blackwood placed the folder on the table between them. "But given your new role, I believe it is very much your business." He opened the folder and slid out a single document. "Jonathan Caldwell left his entire fortune to the Foundation," he said, "with one stipulation, that Margaret would serve as chairwoman and receive a generous stipend for her lifetime." Ethan nodded slowly. "That seems reasonable." "Indeed. Except for one detail." Blackwood tapped the document. "The stipend continues only so long as Margaret maintains Jonathan's core mission. Should the board determine that mission has been compromised, control shifts to a vote." Ethan's frown deepened. "And?" Blackwood leaned forward. 2 months ago, Margaret began withdrawing from the Foundation's activities, canceling meetings, avoiding public appearances. The board was concerned." He paused, watching Ethan closely. "Then, suddenly, she returns with you, proof of Jonathan's vision. A touching story of grocery store charity. The perfect narrative." Ethan felt cold spreading through his chest. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," Blackwood said carefully, "that Margaret Caldwell needed a story, a symbol. And she found one, in you." "That's not—" "Did you know," Blackwood interrupted, "that if Margaret loses her position, she loses not just the stipend, but the estate? The cars? The lifestyle she's grown accustomed to?" Ethan stared at him. "That can't be true." It is. Blackwood's voice softened. Jonathan believed in accountability, even for those he loved. He slid a second document across the table. A bank statement with Margaret's name. 2 weeks before she met you, she withdrew $50,000 in cash. Blackwood's eyes never left Ethan's. A rather large amount, wouldn't you agree? Almost as if she was preparing for something. Ethan pushed the papers away. This proves nothing. Perhaps not, Blackwood conceded. But consider this. What is more likely? That Margaret Caldwell, grieving widow of a billionaire philanthropist, was genuinely shopping for groceries she couldn't afford? Or that she was looking for a story, a narrative, to secure her position? The question hung in the air between them. You paid for her groceries, Blackwood continued. A touching gesture. But did you ever wonder how a woman like Margaret Caldwell came to be in your checkout line in the first place? In a grocery store across town from her estate? At exactly the moment you were working. Ethan's mind raced back to that night. The trembling hands. The quiet desperation. The way she'd put back items one by one. It had seemed so genuine. But now. I don't believe you, he said, but his voice betrayed his uncertainty. Blackwood nodded, as if he'd expected exactly this response. I understand. Loyalty is an admirable quality. He stood, gathering the documents. But ask yourself this, Mr. Becket. If Margaret truly believed in you for your own sake, why hasn't she told you about Jonathan's illness? Ethan blinked. What? Blackwood's expression shifted to something like pity. She hasn't mentioned that Jonathan's foundation was inspired by his own health struggles? That his philanthropic focus came from personal experience. He closed his briefcase with a soft click. Ask her about the children's wing at Memorial Hospital, he said quietly. Ask her why Jonathan cared so much about medical access for low-income families. And then ask yourself why she kept that from you. Blackwood placed a business card on the table. When you're ready to talk again, call me, he said. In the meantime, I suggest you look more closely at the woman who's offering you the world. And with that, he walked away, leaving Ethan with cold coffee and a growing sense of doubt. Margaret smiled when Ethan entered the conference room for the Education Committee meeting. But her smile faltered when she saw his expression. Ethan? Is everything all right? The committee members were gathering, arranging papers, pouring coffee. Ethan leaned closer to Margaret. Did Jonathan have health problems? He asked quietly. Margaret went very still. Why do you ask? Just something I heard, Ethan said. About the children's wing at Memorial Hospital. Something flickered in Margaret's eyes. Pain, memory, and something else. Something that looked like guilt. After the meeting, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We'll talk. The meeting crawled by. Ethan barely heard the presentations, the discussions, the decisions being made. All he could focus on was Margaret's face, the tension around her mouth, the way she kept glancing at him when she thought he wasn't looking. When the room finally emptied, she closed the door and turned to face him. You spoke with Victor, she said. It wasn't a question. Ethan nodded. This morning. Margaret's shoulders slumped. And he told you about Jonathan's childhood. About the leukemia. No, Ethan said softly. He just said to ask you. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, they shone with tears. Jonathan was diagnosed when he was 9, she said. His family couldn't afford proper treatment. He nearly died because of it. She walked to the window, her back to Ethan. When he recovered, he promised himself that no child would ever face what he did. That's why he built the foundation. Why medical access was always at its core. She turned back to him. I didn't tell you because it wasn't relevant to your story. To why I chose you. Ethan studied her. And the money you withdrew? 2 weeks before we met. Margaret's face paled. He showed you that? Yes. She shook her head, a bitter smile twisting her lips. Victor has always been thorough, especially when he's building a case. Is it true? Ethan pressed. Did you withdraw $50,000 in cash? Yes, she admitted. But not for the reason he implied. Then why? Margaret hesitated, conflict playing across her face. Because, she said finally, I was planning to leave. To end it all. The words hung in the air. The foundation. My life. Everything. Her voice cracked. After Jonathan died, I couldn't see the point anymore. The world felt cold. Empty. She met Ethan's gaze, and the raw pain in her eyes made his chest ache. I withdrew the money to settle my affairs, to make sure certain people were taken care of. And then... She swallowed hard. And then I decided to give Jonathan one last chance, to see if he was right about humanity. By testing people, Ethan said quietly. Yes. She didn't flinch from the accusation in his tone. I went to places we'd supported, disguised myself, pushed people to their limits, and no one showed the kindness Jonathan believed in. Her voice strengthened. Until you. Ethan wanted to believe her, but doubt had taken root. How do I know that's true? He asked. How do I know this isn't exactly what Blackwood suggested, a story you created to save your position? Margaret's expression hardened. Because if all I wanted was to keep my stipend, Ethan, I would have found an easier way than this. I would have staged something public. Photogenic. Not a private moment in a grocery store checkout line. She stepped closer to him. And I certainly wouldn't have offered you a position that gives you access to our records, our meetings, our decisions. Her eyes flashed. If I were manipulating you, the last thing I would do is bring you inside. Ethan hesitated. Her logic made sense. But why didn't you tell me about Jonathan's illness? He asked again. Margaret's shoulders slumped. Because I was ashamed, she whispered. Ashamed that I had given up on his dream, on the purpose that had saved his life. She wiped a tear from her cheek. And because I was afraid. Of what? That if you knew how personal this was, how much it meant to Jonathan, to me, you might feel too much pressure. That you might run. Ethan studied her, searching for deception, for manipulation. He found only grief, and hope, and fear. Victor wants me to doubt you, he said slowly. Why? Margaret's expression darkened. Because if he turns you against me, he eliminates the one thing keeping the board on my side. Your story. Your presence. She met his gaze directly. He's playing a game, Ethan. And you're the most valuable piece. Is Margaret telling the truth? Or has Ethan been a pawn all along? The accusation festered. For days, Ethan moved through his life in a fog of doubt. He attended foundation meetings. He helped Matilda with her homework. He smiled when required. But inside, suspicion coiled like a snake. What if Margaret had manipulated him from the beginning? What if his kindness hadn't been random but targeted? What if everything, the trust, the opportunity, the future he'd begun to imagine, was built on lies? He found himself watching Margaret closely, searching for tells, for inconsistencies, for proof of either deception or honesty. But all he saw was a grieving woman trying to honor her husband's legacy. Victor Blackwood, meanwhile, had become a shadow at the edge of Ethan's awareness, always present in meetings, always watching, always with that calculating smile that suggested he knew something Ethan didn't. One evening, as Ethan helped Matilda prepare for a science fair, his phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. Margaret, need to speak with you. Urgent. Can you meet tonight? He stared at the message, conflicted. Who's that? Matilda asked, looking up from her solar system model. My boss, Ethan said. Because how else could he describe Margaret? Matilda studied him with eyes too wise for her age. You're different lately. What do you mean? Sadder. More worried. She hesitated. Is the money going away? The question hit him like a blow. Because of course Matilda had noticed the changes, the full refrigerator, the paid bills, the new clothes. And of course she was waiting for it all to disappear. Their lives had taught her that good things never lasted. No, Ethan said firmly. The money isn't going away. But what if it is? Whispered a voice in his mind. What if Margaret is using you? What if Blackwood is right? Matilda nodded, but her eyes remained uncertain. Promise. Ethan hesitated. And in that moment of hesitation, he saw the flicker of understanding in his sister's eyes. The recognition that he wasn't sure. That their safety was still conditional. I promise I'll take care of you, he said instead. No matter what. It was the only promise he knew he could keep. Margaret waited for him on a bench in the small park near his apartment building. Her face was pale in the glow of the street lamps, her hands clutched tightly in her lap. Thank you for coming, she said as he approached. Ethan sat beside her, leaving a careful distance between them. What's so urgent? Margaret took a deep breath. Victor is making his move. He's called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. A vote of no confidence. Ethan's stomach dropped. Can he do that? Yes. And if he succeeds, control of the foundation will shift to the executive committee, which he effectively controls. Her voice hardened. Everything Jonathan built will be dismantled, redirected, transformed into something he would have hated. And your position, the stipend. Margaret's laugh was bitter. Gone. But that's not what matters, Ethan. She turned to face him. What matters is the work, the mission, all the people who depend on the foundation's support. She reached for his hand, but Ethan pulled away. Margaret's face fell. You still don't trust me, she whispered. I don't know what to believe, Ethan admitted. Blackwood says you manipulated me. You say you didn't. I have no way to know which is true. Yes, you do, Margaret said fiercely. You know it here. She touched her chest. The same place that told you to help me that night in the grocery store. The same instinct that recognized someone in pain. Ethan shook his head. Maybe that instinct was wrong. Maybe I'm not cut out for any of this. Ethan, do you know what Matilda just asked me? He interrupted. If the money was going away. Because that's her world. Things get better, then they get worse again. People help, then they leave. Nothing good lasts. His voice cracked. I promised her I'd take care of her. But I don't know if I can keep that promise anymore. Not if everything I've been building these past weeks is a lie. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. It's not a lie, she whispered. But I can't prove that to you. I can only ask you to believe me. Ethan stood. I'll be at the meeting tomorrow, he said, his voice hollow. But I don't know whose side I'll be on. Margaret remained on the bench, her silhouette small against the darkness of the park. And as Ethan walked away, he felt something break inside him, the fragile hope he'd been nurturing since the day Margaret had appeared in Palmer's grocery with an envelope and a promise. Has Ethan made a terrible mistake? And what will he discover at tomorrow's board meeting? Sleep never came. Ethan paced his apartment until dawn, Blackwood's insinuations colliding with Margaret's tearful denials in his mind. By 5 a.m., he'd made a decision. He needed to find the truth himself, before the board meeting. The foundation building was quiet at 6:30, just a security guard and a few early custodial staff. Ethan nodded to them as he took the elevator to the records room on the 29th floor, a space Margaret had shown him during his orientation, with digital archives of every project the foundation had funded. Looking for something specific? Asked an older security guard who had followed him up. Just clarity, Ethan replied. The man studied him. You're Mrs. Caldwell's new protégé. I guess so. She believes in you. It wasn't a question. Makes sense. She has good instincts about people. Ethan paused. You know her well? 12 years I've worked here. The guard's eyes crinkled. Mr. Caldwell hired me after I got sick. Couldn't do police work anymore. No one would touch me with my medical history. But he did. Ethan nodded slowly. And Margaret? What do you think of her? The guard's expression softened. After Mr. Caldwell died, she came here every night for weeks. Just sat in his office. Crying. Not eating. Scaring us all. Then one day she stopped coming. He hesitated. We thought, well, we were worried. Then she returned a few weeks ago. Different. Like she'd found something to live for again. He gave Ethan a meaningful look. That was right after she met you. The guard left Ethan alone with his thoughts and the Foundation's records. For the next hour, Ethan dug through files. Financial reports. Meeting minutes. Searching for anything that might confirm or refute Blackwood's accusations. What he found instead was Margaret's name, over and over. Personal donations to families struggling with medical bills. Anonymous contributions to children's cancer research. A shelter for teenage mothers that had nearly closed until an unnamed donor stepped in. All after Jonathan's death. All from Margaret's personal accounts, not the Foundation's. And then he found it, the thread that unraveled everything. A small memorial fund established at the Children's Hospital, dedicated to a baby named Clara, with a familiar date that made Ethan's blood run cold. Clara Caldwell, beloved daughter of Jonathan and Margaret. Born and died on the same day, 32 years ago. Ethan's hands shook as he pulled up more records. Hospital donations. Research grants. Support for grieving parents. Margaret hadn't just been honoring Jonathan's childhood illness. She'd been honoring their child. The baby they'd lost before she could draw her first breath. The revelation staggered him. This wasn't the behavior of a woman manipulating a system for financial gain. This was a mother who had never stopped grieving. A wife carrying on her husband's legacy even when she'd lost faith in humanity. A woman who had been ready to end it all until a cashier's kindness gave her a reason to believe again. Ethan checked the time. 7:45. The board meeting was at 8:30. He grabbed his phone. Ethan, where are you? Margaret's response came immediately. Margaret, home. Getting ready for the meeting. Ethan, don't move. I'm coming to you. Margaret's home was a colonial mansion on the outskirts of the city, elegant, understated, with gardens that must have been spectacular in spring but now lay dormant under December frost. She opened the door herself, surprise evident in her eyes. Ethan? What? I found Clara's memorial fund, he said without preamble. Margaret went still. And I found the donations you've been making. Personally. Anonymously. Even when you said you'd lost faith. Her eyes filled with tears. You weren't supposed to see those. Why not? Because they weren't about faith, she whispered. They were about obligation. About guilt. Ethan shook his head. No. They were about love. Margaret's composure cracked. Clara would have been 32 this year, she said, her voice breaking. I was 7 months pregnant when my body betrayed me. When she came too soon to survive. Ethan stepped forward and did what he should have done the night before. He took her hands in his. Jonathan never blamed me, Margaret continued. He channeled his grief into the Foundation. Into helping others. But I never forgave myself. The glass angel, Ethan said softly. In the grocery store. That wasn't random, was it? Margaret shook her head. We bought one every Christmas. It was our tradition. Our way of including her. A sob escaped her. After Jonathan died, I couldn't bear to do it alone. But that night in the store, I thought maybe. You were testing me, Ethan said. No. Her eyes met his, fierce through her tears. I was testing myself to see if I could still feel something, anything beyond the grief. Understanding dawned like sunrise after the longest night. And when I helped you, you reminded me what it felt like to receive kindness, she said simply. You gave me back my purpose. Ethan squeezed her hands. Victor Blackwood has been lying to me, he said, trying to turn me against you. Margaret nodded. Of course he has. Because you're the one thing he can't control. Then let's make sure he never does. Ethan's voice strengthened. I have an idea. Can Ethan and Margaret outmaneuver Blackwood? Or will the truth they've uncovered come too late? The boardroom fell silent as Ethan entered with Margaret. Victor Blackwood stood at the head of the table, mid-sentence, his expression flickering from confidence to wariness when he saw them together. Mrs. Caldwell, he said smoothly, and Mr. Becket. We weren't expecting you for another 15 minutes. Clearly, Margaret replied, noting the papers spread across the table, documents that should have waited for her arrival. Ethan surveyed the room. All 12 board members present. Faces he'd come to recognize over the past weeks. Some concerned, some curious, some carefully blank. Please continue, Margaret said, taking her seat. Ethan remained standing. You were about to propose something? Blackwood recovered quickly. A vote of no confidence, he said, his voice steady, based on concerns about the Foundation's direction, and about certain decisions made recently. His gaze shifted to Ethan, such as bringing in untested, unqualified individuals to influence philanthropic policy. The accusation hung in the air. Before we proceed, Ethan said, stepping forward, I'd like to share something I discovered this morning. Blackwood's eyes narrowed. This meeting follows a specific protocol. Let him speak, Victor, said Eleanor Vance from the far end of the table. I think we all want to hear what Mr. Becket has to say. Blackwood's jaw tightened, but he nodded curtly. Ethan took a deep breath. For the past week, I've been investigating, he said, looking into the Foundation's records, its history, and its people. He withdrew a folder from his bag, identical to the one Blackwood had shown him in the cafe. What I found was unexpected, he continued, opening the folder. Evidence of personal donations made by Mrs. Caldwell after her husband's death. Anonymous contributions to causes the Foundation supports. Money given not from Foundation accounts, but from her own. A murmur rippled through the room. Interesting timing, Blackwood commented. Finding such evidence just before this meeting. Ethan met his gaze evenly. I also found something else, he said, his voice dropping. Something about a memorial fund. For a baby named Clara. The room went absolutely still. Margaret's face paled, but she sat straighter in her chair. My daughter, she said into the silence. Jonathan's and mine. She lived for 17 minutes. Blackwood's expression shifted, surprise, then calculation. A tragic loss, he said carefully, but hardly relevant to today's. It's the Foundation's genesis, Ethan interrupted. The real reason Jonathan devoted his life to helping others. Not just his childhood illness, though that was part of it, but Clara, the child they lost because, as Mrs. Caldwell told me, her body betrayed her. He looked around the table. The memorial fund was established the day after Clara died. The children's hospital wing came next. Then support for maternal health in underserved communities. Ethan's voice strengthened. Everything this foundation stands for began with love, with loss, with the desire to ensure no other parent felt as helpless as they did. Blackwood's jaw tightened. An emotional appeal doesn't change the facts. Margaret has been withdrawing from her responsibilities, making questionable decisions. The board has a duty to... To what, Victor? Margaret interrupted, her voice quiet but firm. To fulfill Jonathan's vision? or to transform this foundation into what you've always wanted it to be, a strategic, calculated, emotionless entity that prioritizes influence over impact. Influence is impact, Blackwood countered. Sentiment doesn't feed children or build hospitals. No, Ethan said. But it's why we build them in the first place. He turned to the board. Mr. Blackwood showed me bank records last week, he said. A cash withdrawal Mrs. Caldwell made shortly before we met. He implied it was evidence of manipulation, of a scheme to maintain her position. Blackwood's face remained impassive. What he didn't know, Ethan continued, was that I recognized something in that withdrawal date. He pulled out the final document, a simple calendar page with a date circled in red. It was Clara's birthday, he said softly, and the day Mrs. Caldwell had decided would be her last. Gasps echoed around the table. Margaret's eyes closed briefly. The money wasn't for manipulation, Ethan said. It was for closure, for settling affairs, for making sure certain people would be taken care of after she was gone. He met Blackwood's gaze directly, but she didn't go through with it. Instead, she decided to give Jonathan's belief in humanity one last test. She went to a grocery store across town, put items in her cart she knew she couldn't afford, including a glass angel ornament, the same kind they bought every Christmas for Clara. Eleanor Vance's eyes filled with tears. I remember those angels, she whispered. Jonathan showed me their collection once. Ethan nodded. Mrs. Caldwell wasn't looking for a story that night, he said. She was looking for a reason to live, for proof that kindness still existed in a world that had taken too much from her. He stepped closer to Blackwood. And that, Mr. Blackwood, is what you've been trying to destroy. Not just Margaret's position, not just my opportunity, but the very heart of what makes this foundation matter. The room fell silent. Blackwood's expression hardened. A touching narrative, he said coldly. But the vote of no confidence remains on the table, unless Mrs. Caldwell can demonstrate how her recent actions, including elevating an untested grocery clerk to a position of influence, serve the foundation's interests. Margaret stood. I believe I can, she said. She reached into her purse and withdrew a sealed envelope, cream-colored, elegant. This is from Jonathan, written a week before he died. She handed it to Eleanor. Would you read it, please? Aloud. Eleanor opened the envelope with trembling fingers. My dearest friends and colleagues, she read, if you are hearing these words, it means Margaret has found what I asked her to seek, proof that kindness still exists when no one is watching. For 32 years, we have built this foundation on the belief that compassion matters, that generosity can change lives, that the value of what we do isn't measured in tax breaks or social capital, but in moments of genuine human connection. The person standing before you represents such a moment. I don't know their name. I don't know their story. But I know this: they gave without expectation. They helped without agenda. And in doing so, they embodied everything this foundation stands for. My final wish is that you welcome them, not as a charity case, but as a partner. A voice we desperately need. Someone who understands, in a way many of us have forgotten, why this work matters. Trust Margaret. Trust this person. And most of all, trust the mission that has guided us from the beginning, to create a world where kindness isn't extraordinary, but expected. With love and gratitude, Jonathan. Silence filled the room as Eleanor finished reading. Margaret looked around the table, her eyes bright with tears and determination. I call for a vote, she said. Not on confidence in my leadership, but on whether we still believe in Jonathan's vision, in kindness, in the foundation's true purpose. She turned to Blackwood. What say you, Victor? The tension in the room was palpable. And then, slowly, Eleanor Vance raised her hand. I believe, she said simply. One by one, hands rose around the table, all except Blackwood's. He looked from face to face, calculation giving way to resignation. It seems I've misread the room, he said finally. He gathered his papers with precise movements. And perhaps the foundation as well. He stood, buttoning his suit jacket. I'll have my resignation on your desk by morning, Margaret, he said quietly. 30 years is long enough to realize when one's vision no longer aligns with the majority. Without another word, he walked from the room. The door closed behind him with a soft click that echoed like thunder. Margaret let out a shaky breath. And in that moment, as board members rose to embrace her, to shake Ethan's hand, to whisper words of support and solidarity, Ethan realized something profound. The kindness he'd shown that night in the grocery store hadn't just changed Margaret's life. It had changed everything. How will Ethan's life transform? And what final gift does Margaret have to share? 1 year later, Christmas Eve gleamed with quiet magic. Ethan stood in the doorway of his new home, not a mansion, but a warm, solid house with working heat and windows that didn't rattle when the wind blew. From the living room came the sound of Matilda's laughter, mingled with Margaret's gentle voice as they hung ornaments on a tree that brushed the ceiling. A real tree, just like the one his mother had wanted. So much had changed in a year. Matilda attended the city's best school now, her quick mind flourishing with proper resources. She'd made friends, joined clubs, stopped carrying the worried look that had aged her beyond her years. And Ethan had found his purpose. After Blackwood's departure, the Caldwell Foundation had undergone a transformation. With Margaret as chairwoman and Ethan as program director, they'd refocused on direct impact, medical assistance for families like his had been, education for children like Matilda, support for those one crisis away from collapse. He'd finished his degree, too. Not in education as he'd originally planned, but in nonprofit management, a path that felt like it had been waiting for him all along. "Ethan!" Matilda called. "Come see what Margaret brought." He joined them in the living room, where the tree sparkled with white lights and mismatched ornaments, some new, some salvaged from their old apartment, all meaningful. Margaret stood by the fireplace, holding a small box wrapped in silver paper. "I wanted to wait until tonight," she said, her eyes warm. "It seemed right somehow." Ethan took the box, feeling its lightness in his hands. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, lay a glass angel ornament, identical to the one that had started everything a year ago. But this one had a small golden plaque on its base. "Clara and Evelyn, watching over us all." Ethan's breath caught. Evelyn, his mother's name. "I hope it's all right," Margaret said softly. "I thought they should be together, looking after us." Tears blurred Ethan's vision. He nodded, unable to speak. Matilda touched the angel gently. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Ethan handed it to her. "You should hang it," he said, "right at the top." Together, they watched as Matilda carefully placed the angel on the highest branch she could reach. "Perfect," Margaret said. She looked different now, still elegant, still carrying grief that would never fully disappear, but lighter somehow. More present. The mourning pin was gone from her lapel, replaced by a simple silver dove that Jonathan had given her on their first anniversary. "I have news," she said as they settled on the couch. "The board unanimously approved our new initiative this morning. The Neighborhood Angels program, Ethan's brainchild. Microloans and support for people who, like him, helped others despite having little themselves. A way to recognize and amplify everyday kindness." "That's wonderful," Ethan said. "It's more than that," Margaret replied. "It's a legacy. Yours and Jonathan's both." Outside, snow began to fall, thick, silent flakes that muffled the world and made everything feel closer, warmer, more intimate. "A year ago tonight," Margaret said quietly, "I was ready to give up, to stop fighting, to let the darkness win." She reached over and squeezed Ethan's hand. "You didn't just pay for my groceries, Ethan. You paid for my future, my purpose, my reason to keep going." Ethan shook his head. "I didn't do anything special." "That's exactly what makes it special," Margaret countered. "You helped because it was the right thing to do, not for recognition." not for reward. Just because someone was struggling and you could ease that struggle, even at cost to yourself. Matilda, who had been listening quietly, nodded. That's just who he is, she said with the simple certainty of a child who knows she is loved. He takes care of people. Margaret smiled. Yes, he does. And now, he's teaching others to do the same. She gestured to the window, where the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in quiet possibility. That's what the foundation is really about. Not just giving money, but giving hope. Not just building institutions, but building a world where kindness is the expectation, not the exception. Ethan felt warmth spread through his chest, a feeling he'd come to recognize as contentment, as purpose, as belonging. Jonathan would be proud, he said. Margaret's eyes shone. He is, she said simply. I can feel it. Later that night, after Matilda had gone to bed and Margaret had returned to her own home, Ethan stood alone in the living room, watching the snow through the window. He thought about the grocery store, about the night that had changed everything, about how a single moment of compassion had rippled outward, transforming not just his life and Matilda's, but countless others through the Foundation's work. He thought about Margaret, finding her way back from the edge of despair, about Jonathan, building a legacy of kindness from his own pain, about his mother, who had taught him that giving mattered even when you had little to give. The angel ornament caught the light, sending prisms dancing across the ceiling. Clara and Evelyn, watching over us all. Sometimes, Ethan reflected, the smallest acts contain the greatest power. A hand extended, a burden shared, a moment of connection in a world that often felt fractured and cold. And sometimes, that was enough to change everything. I hope this story touched your heart as deeply as it touched mine. The next time you have the chance to help someone, even in what seems like a small way, remember Ethan and Margaret. Remember that kindness creates ripples we can never fully trace. Please leave a comment sharing a moment when someone's kindness changed your path. And if you haven't already, join our ducal family by subscribing. These stories are my gift to you, a reminder that in a world that sometimes feels dark, light always finds a way through.